To his teammates, Fern Flaman was a hero, a fearless captain, a defender who would do anything for them. But to the rest of the league, he was a villain, known for his dirty and ruthless style of play. He had all the trappings of a legend: Stanley Cup champion, multiple All-Star, and captain of the Boston Bruins. Yet, it was that bad reputation that kept him out of the Hall of Fame for 25 years. So, what was he really like? A misunderstood warrior, or a player who deserved to be ostracized? This is a story that seeks to answer the question, why is a legend not honored? To truly understand the man, you must first understand the world that forged him, the very soil that nurtured his unyielding roots. Ferdinand Charles Flaman wasn't born into a world of cheering crowds and polished ice. He was born on January 25th, 1927, in the small, windswept town of Dysart, Saskatchewan. This was the absolute heart of the Canadian prairies during the Great Depression, a time and place defined by unrelenting hardship. It was a stark landscape of endless dusty fields, brutally cold winters, and a people whose characters were hardened by the daily, grinding struggle for simple survival. This was not a world that afforded the luxury of nuance. It was a world of stark black and white, of grueling work and exhausted rest, of stark success and abject failure. You learned from a very young age that absolutely nothing in this life was given to you. Everything, from the food on your table to the roof over your head, had to be earned through sweat, through calloused hands, and through an unbreakable, stubborn will. For the families of Saskatchewan, life itself was a physical test. You worked the land, you endured the elements, and you learned to be tough, because being soft was simply not an option for survival. And in that tough, unforgiving world, there was one great unifying passion, one glorious escape from the ceaseless toil of the farm and the gnawing worry of the times: hockey. But the hockey of the prairies in the 1930s was a far cry from the organized, sanitized sport we recognize today. It was played on frozen ponds and slushy, makeshift outdoor rinks under perpetually gray winter skies. The equipment was rudimentary at best: worn, second-hand skates, sticks held together with black tape, and pads made from old catalogs stuffed into socks. This was a raw, visceral, almost primal version of the game, less about elegant plays and choreographed power plays, and more about pure, unadulterated physical competition. It was a direct reflection of the life they lived: tough, unforgiving, and fiercely, fiercely competitive. This was the harsh environment that shaped Fern Flaman's character. He wasn't the biggest, the fastest, or the most naturally gifted kid lacing up skates on those frozen ponds, but he was driven by a relentless, almost frightening determination. He learned early on that to succeed, to even be noticed, he had to be tougher, meaner, and more willing to pay the physical price than anyone else. He developed a style of play that was brutally effective, a style born of necessity. He wasn't just on the ice to score goals or make a pretty pass. He was there to impose his will on the opposition, to make them fear coming into his corner of the ice, to make every shift against him a physically miserable experience. The professional world he was destined for, the so-called Original Six era of the National Hockey League, was a different universe, but one for which his upbringing had perfectly prepared him. The league consisted of only 6 teams: the Montreal Canadiens, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Detroit Red Wings, the Chicago Blackhawks, the New York Rangers, and his future home, the Boston Bruins. This small number of teams created an atmosphere of intense, almost suffocating familiarity that bred a deep and abiding hatred. These teams played each other 14 times a season, year after year. Rivalries weren't just competitive, they were personal, deeply ingrained, and often astonishingly violent. The game itself was a war of attrition. There were no helmets. The sticks were unforgiving, unyielding slabs of wood. Medical attention was primitive, with players often being stitched up on a training table between periods and sent right back out. Most critically, there was only one referee on the ice, meaning countless infractions, the hooks, the holds, the spears, went unseen and unpunished. This led to the creation of an unwritten but brutally enforced system of justice known simply as the Code. If a star player was targeted, it was up to his team's designated enforcer to exact a swift and often bloody revenge. Enforcers weren't just players. They were the law. And the game they played was a brutal ballet of sublime skill and savage violence. It was in this crucible, this perfect storm of Depression-era grit and Original Six brutality, that Fern Flaman was destined to become one of the most feared and hated defensemen the game had ever seen. Fern Flaman's journey to the NHL was a testament to that relentless work ethic forged on the prairies. He left Saskatchewan as a teenager to play junior hockey, and his rugged defense-first style quickly caught the attention of professional scouts. In 1944, at the remarkably young age of 17, he signed a contract with the Boston Bruins. He spent a few formative years honing his craft in the rough-and-tumble American Hockey League, primarily with the Hershey Bears, where he adapted his raw aggression into a more strategic, professional brand of intimidation. He made his official NHL debut during the 1946-47 season. The Boston Bruins of that era were a perfect match for Flaman's identity. They were a tough blue-collar team representing a tough blue-collar city. Flaman quickly established himself as a formidable, intimidating presence on their blue line. He was not a flashy player. You would almost never see him leading a graceful end-to-end rush or scoring a highlight reel goal. His art was a darker one, practiced in the shadows and the dirty areas of the ice. He was an absolute master of the hip check, a bone-jarring, perfectly timed hit that used his entire body as a fulcrum to send an opponent cartwheeling through the air. He was physically imposing, cleared the front of his team's net with a ferocious, almost territorial zeal, and he never, ever backed down from a fight. His early years in Boston were a success, establishing him as a top-tier defender. But in a surprising trade in 1950, he was sent to the arch-rival Toronto Maple Leafs, a move that shocked the Boston faithful. For a player who seemed to bleed the Bruins black and gold, it was a jarring transition. But Flaman was the consummate professional. He went to Toronto and became a key component of one of the greatest teams of the era. Playing on a star-studded roster that included legends like Ted Kennedy and Max Bentley, he provided the defensive grit and punishing toughness that balanced their offensive firepower. And in 1951, he reached the pinnacle of the sport. In a legendary Stanley Cup final against the Montreal Canadiens, where all 5 games went into overtime, Flaman was a rock on defense, helping to shut down Montreal's famed punch line and winning the Stanley Cup with the Maple Leafs. He had proven he was not just a tough guy, but a winner at the highest level. But his heart, it seemed, had remained in Boston. In 1954, in a multiplayer trade that delighted Bruins fans, Flaman was brought back to the team where he started. And this time, he wasn't just another player on the roster, he was destined to be the leader. In a move that signaled a shift in the team's identity, he was immediately named captain of the Boston Bruins, a role he would hold with immense pride for the rest of his illustrious career. It was during this second stint with the Bruins, from the mid-1950s until his retirement in 1961, that Fern Flaman's legend and his infamy was truly forged. He became the undisputed heart and soul of the team, its leader on and off the ice. As captain, he fully embraced the role of protector. If an opponent took a liberty with a Bruins star like Milt Schmidt or the high-scoring Leo Labine, they knew they would have to answer to Fern Flaman. He was the enforcer, the policeman, the gatekeeper who ensured that no one took advantage of his teammates. His presence alone made his fellow Bruins play with more confidence. He led the Bruins to 3 Stanley Cup finals during his time as captain. While they were never able to overcome the dynastic powerhouse Montreal Canadiens of that era, Flaman's leadership was undeniable. He was a 5-time NHL All-Star, an honor that repeatedly recognized him as one of the very best defensemen in the world. His statistics were impressive for a defensive defenseman of his time, but his true value could never be captured on a score sheet. His value was measured in the fear he instilled in his opponents and the boundless courage he instilled in his teammates. He played through countless injuries, broken bones, deep cuts, sprained ligaments, absorbing and dishing out punishment in equal and often greater measure. During one game, he took a puck directly to the face, opening a deep, bloody gash that would require dozens of stitches. In an era before visors, this was a common but always serious injury. The team doctor began the painstaking process of stitching him up in the locker room, but Flaman, hearing the roar of the crowd and sensing a shift in the game's momentum, simply got up off the table, told the doctor to finish the job later, and went right back out onto the ice, his face a grotesque mask of blood. This was the man his teammates saw, a selfless leader who would sacrifice anything for the team. This was the man Bruins fans adored, a throwback, a gritty, hard-nosed player who embodied the spirit of their city. But for the other 5 teams in the league, for the players who had to line up against him night after night, this same man was something else entirely. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a warrior. He was a villain of the highest and most despised order. To his teammates, he was fearless Fernie, the ultimate protector and a beloved captain. But to his opponents, he was something far more sinister. Across the league, he was widely considered one of the dirtiest, most vicious players in the National Hockey League. This wasn't just the opinion of a few disgruntled players who came out on the losing end of a battle. It was a deeply held conviction across the league, a reputation he had methodically earned over 15 years of brutal, punishing hockey. So, what exactly did he do that made him so uniquely despised? It went well beyond just fighting or hitting hard. The league was filled with tough guys, but opponents accused Flaman of a calculated, cold-blooded, almost cruel approach to his physical play. He was said to have an uncanny, encyclopedic memory for injuries. If a star player was nursing a sore shoulder, a bruised rib, or a bad knee, Flaman would know. And throughout the course of a 60-minute game, he would make it his personal mission to target that specific injury, not with one obvious illegal blow that would draw a penalty, but with a dozen small, persistent, and incredibly painful attacks. A can opener with his stick to the ribs in a scrum, a little spear to the shoulder after the whistle, an extra shove into the boards aimed squarely at the weak spot. This was his signature tactic, what opponents bitterly called trapping. It was a form of methodical, psychological, and physical warfare. He wasn't just trying to win the game in front of him. He was trying to break his opponent's will for the next game, and the one after that. He wanted to make them think twice about going into the corners, to make them play in constant nagging fear of aggravating their injury. It was a strategy of attrition, and he was its master practitioner. One of his most famous and acrimonious rivalries was with the legendary Jean Béliveau, the elegant, towering superstar of the Montreal Canadiens. Béliveau was the epitome of grace and skill, a player who floated above the muck of the game. Flaman was his polar opposite, a man who lived and thrived in that muck. In the 1955 Stanley Cup playoffs, Béliveau was playing with a painful separated shoulder. According to the Canadiens' camp and numerous press reports from the time, Flaman spent the entire series relentlessly targeting that shoulder with his stick. The series culminated in an incident where Flaman allegedly delivered a vicious spear directly into the injured area, re-injuring Béliveau and effectively knocking him out of the playoffs. The Canadiens were absolutely furious, calling it a deliberate, cowardly act designed solely to injure a star player. Flaman, of course, publicly denied any specific intent, claiming it was just the unavoidable result of hard-nosed playoff hockey. But the incident was burned into the memory of the league. It cemented his reputation as a man who would cross any line to win. Even the toughest, most respected players in the league spoke of him with a mixture of professional respect and personal dread. Gordie Howe, Mr. Hockey himself, a man who was arguably the toughest and most dominant player of all time, called Flaman one of the meanest and most difficult opponents he ever faced. When Gordie Howe, a man who feared no one, says you're mean, you are in a very exclusive class. The press of the era often portrayed him as a caricature of a hockey goon. He was the perfect villain in the black and gold jersey, the man the fans in Montreal, Toronto, and New York loved to hate. His penalty minute totals were consistently among the highest in the league. But to simply label him a goon would be to fundamentally misunderstand his game. Flaman wasn't a mindless thug. He was a highly intelligent player and a shrewd tactician. His physical attacks were strategic, designed with the specific purpose of disrupting the other team's offensive flow and neutralizing their best players. He played on the very edge of the rules, and often right over it. He understood that in the brutal, under-policed world of Original Six, hockey, intimidation was as valuable a weapon as a hard slap shot. This raises a fascinating and difficult question that lies at the heart of his story. Was Fern Flaman a truly dirty player? Or was he simply a perfect product of his time, playing the game the only way he knew how to win in an era that demanded it? In a league with one referee and a deeply ingrained culture of self-policing, perhaps his brand of frontier justice was not only accepted by his team, but deemed absolutely necessary for their survival and success. His teammates certainly saw it that way. To them, he was simply doing what had to be done. But for the men on the other side of the ice, nursing their bruises and their lingering anger, the answer was crystal clear. He was a menace, a player who deliberately crossed the line between tough and dirty, and many of them would never, ever forgive him for it. And it was this reputation, this dark cloud of infamy that hung over his entire career, that would follow him long after he hung up his skates and walked away from the game. In 1961, after a storied 15-season career, Fern Flaman retired. He left the game with a resume that was, on paper, impeccable. A Stanley Cup champion, a 5-time NHL All-Star, a long-serving and respected captain of an Original Six team. He had played nearly 1,000 games in the toughest defensive role imaginable, in the toughest era imaginable. By any objective measure, he was a prime candidate for the Hockey Hall of Fame. In the years immediately following his retirement, other defensemen from his era, with similar, or in some cases, even lesser, credentials were being inducted one by one. But year after year, when the announcements were made, Fern Flaman's name was not called. The years began to turn into a decade. The 1960s passed, an entire era of new stars. Then the 1970s, with its own legendary players. Still nothing. The 1980s came and went. A whole new generation of players had started, completed, and been celebrated for their careers. And still, Fern Flaman remained on the outside looking in. It was no longer just an oversight. It was a clear, deliberate, and undeniable snub. And everyone in the hockey world, from the players to the press, knew exactly why. It was his reputation. The very same qualities that made him so valuable to his own team had made him a pariah to the influential gatekeepers of the Hall of Fame. The Hockey Hall of Fame Selection Committee is a historically secretive body. Their deliberations are not made public, and they rarely explain their choices. But the unwritten rule, the quiet understanding, has always been that character matters. It's not just about what you did on the ice, but how you did it. And in the minds of many on that committee for many years, Flaman had crossed a fundamental line. The stories of him targeting injuries, the public accusations from revered players like Béliveau, the sheer number of powerful enemies he had made throughout his career, it all added up. They saw him not as a tough competitor, but as a player who lacked sportsmanship, who willfully violated the spirit of the game. This created a fierce, behind-the-scenes debate that simmered for years in the hockey community. On one side, you had his passionate supporters, mostly former teammates, Bruins loyalists, and hockey historians, who argued that it was a gross and hypocritical injustice. They claimed that Flaman was being unfairly judged by a moral standard that simply didn't exist in the era he played. They argued that his job on those Bruins teams was to be the enforcer, the policeman, and he did it better than almost anyone. They pointed to his unwavering leadership, his Stanley Cup ring, and his multiple All-Star selections as undeniable, objective proof of his greatness. On the other side were his powerful detractors, many of whom were the very players, coaches, and executives who had felt the sting of his aggressive play firsthand. They believed that the Hall of Fame should be reserved for players who not only excelled, but also honored the game with their conduct. They felt that inducting Flaman would be a tacit endorsement of a style of play that they found reprehensible. Flaman himself rarely spoke of the snub publicly. He was a proud man, not one to lobby for his own cause. After retiring as a player, he embarked on a long and highly successful second career as the head coach of the Northeastern University hockey team in Boston. For 19 seasons, he was a respected and beloved mentor to hundreds of young student athletes. He taught the game with passion and intelligence, and his players swore by him, many regarding him as a father figure. This was the great confounding paradox of Fern Flaman. The man despised by so many of his professional peers was absolutely adored by the college players he coached. It revealed a completely different side of his character, that of a patient teacher, a a compassionate leader, and a man who cared deeply about the sport and the young men who played it. Still, the years passed. 20 years, 21, 24. It seemed as though he would be forever forgotten by the Hall of Fame, a casualty of his own fearsome reputation, a legend whose legacy was destined to be defined not by his achievements, but by the bitter grudges he had left in his wake. Then, in 1990, after a quarter of a century of waiting, something finally changed. The old guard on the selection committee had slowly been replaced by a new generation. This new group was perhaps better able to view the original six era with a more objective, historical perspective. They looked past the old grudges, the bitter rivalries, and saw the player for what he was, one of the most dominant, effective, and influential defensemen of his time. They recognized that the game he played was a product of that specific era, and that judging him by the standards of the 1980s was both anachronistic and unfair. The phone finally rang. After 25 years of waiting in the wilderness, Fern Flaman, at the age of 63, was finally getting his place among the immortals. After his Hall of Fame induction, Fern Flaman lived a relatively quiet life, enjoying his retirement years after a long career in hockey as a player and coach. He lived a full life, and finally, on June 22, 2012, Fern Flaman passed away in Westwood, Massachusetts, at the age of 85. The Boston Bruins organization and former NHL members were among the first to offer condolences. For them, Flaman's passing was the loss of a living piece of history, a symbol of the team's golden era. Perhaps the strongest and most touching reaction came from the Northeastern University community, where he was head coach for 19 years, 1970 to 1989. There, the legacy of Fernie was a far cry from his ruthless image in the NHL. Hundreds of former student athletes shared stories of a dedicated teacher, a mentor, and even a second father. They didn't remember a dirty player. They remembered a man who taught them discipline, hard work, and how to be good men. For the Boston fans who watched him play, his death evoked nostalgia for a bygone era of old-time hockey. They remembered him as the last incarnation of the gritty, never-backing Bruins. To them, he was a true hero. In short, Fern Flaman's death was more than the passing of a great player. It allowed the public to take a more holistic look at his entire life. Instead of remembering only the 25 years he was denied by the Hall of Fame, he was able to honor both the ruthless warrior on the ice and the respected teacher off it. His passing brought to a close a life filled with paradoxes, but ultimately cemented his legacy as one of the most complex and fascinating figures in hockey history.